Serious, employees at mental health wards, what was the strangest, creepiest, or scariest experience you had there? My client had Fragile X, cerebral palsy, intermittent explosive disorder and Mr. He loved to reenact WWE storylines. He would continuously try to attack me with wrestling moves, albeit in slow motion due to his disability. An old man charging at you while screaming John Cena sounds pretty terrifying. My clients have dementia, and there's one who creeps me out a lot. During the day, she's the sweetest old lady, but at night she sleep talks. And it's not normal sleep talking. Her eyes are open, and sometimes she's sitting up. Sometimes it's impossible to tell when she has gone from sleeping to being awake, until she turns to you and asks if you've seen the little girl that was just here, that she was talking to. She talks about people being there all the time, including a little boy that has died, and she wonders what we should do with the body, a little girl that sleeps with her, a man that orders her around, and her dead husband who is always looking for her. I heard her talking once, and she was being very loud, but as I reached the open doorway she said SHHH, they're all sleeping. Better not talk about it now, and she promptly stopped talking and just lay there very still. Worked at a nursing home. 90-year-old Alzheimer's patient and former nurse would frequently put on gloves and stick her fingers up her butt, pull crap out if she was ever constipated. We eventually ended up giving her every other day laxatives to prevent this from happening. One day she did this, and while it was in her hands she got the idea that it was no longer her own feces but it was soap. She got down on her hands and knees and scrubbed the floor with her feces and then put the remainder of it in the soap dish in the bathroom, which was not a soap dish. It was her sleeping roommate's denture cup. It was the weirdest thing I ever walked in on. Her roommate was P. Thanks for the gold. 3. Just made this throwaway specifically to reply here. I'm a counselor in a facility for people experiencing mental health crises. Recently we had a client who was experiencing active schizophrenic psychosis with her hallucinations manifesting in the form of demons that follow her around. It was really unsettling seeing her talking to them, and frequently the discussion centered around being drenched in blood. She also wouldn't sleep in her bed and slept on her floor, starfished, face down. Checking on her at night was always a little unsettling seeing someone face down starfished out like that on the floor. I was a volunteer at a hospital, visiting people in their rooms. I got so good at Scrabble I could wreck you. One day one of the ladies got out of the mental health ward and walked out of the hospital. It was pouring rain and so a bunch of nurses and volunteers went looking out in the parking lot and in the general area for her. I found her in a little bit of green space by a pond overlooking the highway. I slowly walk this old lady mumbling to herself soaking wet. We get her inside and she holds onto my wrist and won't let go and keeps talking to me and calling me Brad. I found out afterward Brad's the name of her son. I'm a 5'6" Indian guy so it didn't make sense, but she had this creepy death grip on my hands and kept talking to me like I was her son. She didn't let go until 2 nurses pried her hands off me. I didn't see her again, but being a 15-year-old kid who hadn't been volunteering for that long, it certainly freaked me out. Old lady grip strength is real. I don't have a specific story in mind, but I always found it remarkable when you would be having a conversation with a patient who seemed completely normal, to the point where you would really start wondering why they were even there, but then they would just drop in a random comment that showed how fricked up they really were and then just keep going with the conversation. I work in an and due to my country state's poor mental health system we see acute psychotic episodes daily. Over time you get desensitized to it, but there is still one that turns my stomach. A guy was found in a burning abandoned building. Wasn't hurt but was acting so strange the paramedics brought him in. He was homeless, had no id, did not know his name, had 0 drugs in his system. Looking in his eyes, you could tell he wasn't seeing the same thing I was. So I'm trying to get his name or anything out of him and he keeps telling me he was a pilot for the Air Force and flew experimental airplanes because he could withstand the G-force and his blood was naturally thin. The blood tests that measure this actually were fairly higher than normal but not elevated to the point he was on medication for it. So he was right here. I was at the desk telling a co-worker about the stuff this guy was saying when a resident overheard me. He was former Air Force as well and looked like he had seen a ghost. Now I can't remember the name of this place my patient was saying, but as soon as I said it this doctor was freaked out. He said that that city base has no roads in or out and a lot of top secret testing goes down there. He said that you don't know about it unless you've been there. He told me not to talk about it or make a big deal. Gave me an even weirder vibe. Thinking about it, I truly think this guy was telling me the truth. When the government was done with him, they scrambled his brain and kicked him to the streets. He can't remember what he did or who he is and thus poses no threat in sharing information. This also makes him harder to find. Not a conspiracy theorist at all. And psychiatric patients have a lot of paranoia about technology and secret government operations. But this guy seemed real. It's always interesting when crazy delusional things patients say turn out to be real. The guy who said his family was killed by the Mexican mafia. Yeah, right. Nope. His family was killed by the Mexican mafia. Another one said the FBI was after him. This is actually a fairly common delusion. The FBI did show up and talk to this one. So many unsettling things. I work on a secure unit for women with personality disorders who have been sectioned for serious self-harm and suicide attempts. It's adult services, but a lot of our girls have just come from a children's unit, so they're still young. The ways these girls will hurt themselves is unbelievable. Ligatures, cutting, inserting, biting themselves, burning, hair pulling, head banging. The list is endless. I'll never forget a patient we had. She's actually been discharged now, who really suffered. She'd been in services since she was 8 years old, and she was at the time in her late 30s. Anyway, Christmas time she has a few bad anniversaries, rape, friends' deaths, etc. And she starts to struggle, but she likes to bite herself. And I don't mean just a wee little dig of the teeth. She would grab her arm with her teeth and tear the flesh away in huge chunks. And then she would chew it and swallow it. It was like she was possessed. Well, in a way she was, as a voice used to tell her to self-harm. Then after she's ate a massive chunk of her arm or wherever she could reach, in would go the fingers, rummaging in her arm, ripping at tendons and veins, trying to inflict as much damage as possible. I think she was in a permanent restraint for about 3 weeks because she couldn't stop trying to kill herself. I'd only been working there a month. There's many more, but this one sticks with me. A lot of staff vomited after seeing what she'd done. Wherever she could reach, in would go the fingers. Lord have mercy. This is the most awful thing I can ever imagine. 2003. I was an intern psychologist finishing up my training. A mid-20s woman with bipolar 1 was in a manic phase and hypersexuality was one of the symptoms. She was desperate to have sex and was propositioning all the male staff. She finally removed her underwear, snuck up on one of the psychiatrists, a very formal man in his late 60s, wrapped her underwear around his face and her body around him in a bear hug, and started screaming how he should smell her scent and be ready for her to mount him for the ride of his life. The underwear was soaked in period blood, and after 3 of us managed to pull her off, his beard and hair were covered in blood. One of the scariest and funniest, in a morbid way, things I have ever seen. I have several experiences, and it's hard to just choose a few. A guy walked up to the desk, looked straight at a female employee and said, "In my mind, I just killed you." Keep in mind this guy is super creepy, rarely talks but will just look at you with bug eyes. One lady has very specific delusions that people are sexually assaulting her, that it happens in the shower and the blood runs down all the walls. She also believes people cut off parts of her body, that they suture her, including mutilating her genitals and then give them away. She's around 50 or so, and also thinks that someone has stolen her shed and flourish, which basically is her youth, beauty, etc. and gets highly upset thinking other people have taken it from her. She also really hates Justin Bieber for some reason. She will go off about him and think that you are him, that he has demon dogs that do sexual things with him that come after her. She believes her members of her family are getting raped by black men, that they suck them through the seat of a car and that's how they trap them. Had a guy who would speak to his voices, and one time while I was in the room doing work, he started whispering and basically his voices were telling him that I didn't know who the king was and that he should be quiet or else I would find out they were talking. All the while he says this out loud. We had a lady who would go into catatonic states and just stop talking to you and stare like she was in a different dimension. Like she was staring into your soul but at the same time not. She got mad at me once and said, "I'm not God but I'm close enough," and stormed off. She would also chase around one of my co-workers, Take into account she was like a frail 70-year-old woman. At one point she was getting onto the elevator and said she was taking her nursing exam because she was part-time. When she got downstairs, she had passed her exam and then proceeded to follow us around while doing rounds. She wasn't physically intimidating, but just looking at her you knew she was a real special one. We had a woman who would see her dead dog outside and would talk to it through the glass. She also referred to herself in the third person and would shout her name and say as a W. One lady believes she is a realtor banker crime solver. She carries newspaper clippings and believes that people break into her homes and take things from them or sells them without her permission. Particular some of her Hampton homes. She makes a plan to stop drug crime in the state next to us. Because she's a detective. One guy wouldn't give his vitals to the nurse because of the radio waves coming from the technology they put in his arm. He said that he didn't have vitals because of it. Justin Bieber lady appears to be living in Silent Hill. I used to work in an assisted living home where we had elderly residents with dementia. We had one resident who would get up in the middle of the night because he thought he had to go outside and milk the cows. But he didn't realize that he hadn't lived on his farm in 20 years. Anyway, the assisted living was in a wooded area and there was a door alarm that would go off in the middle of the night if any doors were opened. He would always set it off and I would have to run outside in the dark trying to find this client. Now he was little and hunched over and it was creepy as heck to see him walking slowly in the woods at 3 AM. Also, in interning now at an inpatient facility in a hospital, I do assessments on patients and I have had a couple of the male patients just whip out their penis and start masturbating while yelling how much they want my children. It's weird. Definitely the saddest. At a nursing home where I worked, we had a lady who was completely incapacitated and also had dementia. We knew her family that she had been happily married for over 50 years and had a really wonderful life. However, when she first arrived, every time we went to change her brief, redisposable underwear, she would start screaming about rape and crying hysterically. Afterwards it would take her quite a while to forget and calm down. After a few months, she was always screaming about being raped and tortured in a barn, even at mealtime. The family had no idea what was going on and agreed to allow her to be seen by a special psychiatrist. It turned out that she had been horrifically raped and beaten as a child by an older family member. They were out on a farm. She was kept home until she healed, and nothing was ever said about it again. Her children was devastated. She had been keeping that horror inside all those years and had never told anyone. Dementia is a B. It makes you defenseless against all the things you tuck away and refuse to think about, and then those things become so real that there is nothing else. My nana had a revealing dementia freakout like that when she was hospitalized and highly dehydrated. She started screaming her lifelong best friend's name and saying something along the lines of, "We hit him. We hit him. The little boy. Keep driving." She was so worked up they had to sedate her. She's quite far gone. It's never happened since and there's never been an actual explanation. I had a patient who accused a colleague of mine of raping her. She'd follow her around whispering, "You raped me, you raped me, you raped me" over and over again. After a while it became boring, but at first it's really freaking creepy to have that voice following you around. Another patient pulled 2 of her own teeth out and put them under her pillow for the tooth fairy, except we didn't know. So when we came into her room she just had blood flowing out of her mouth, but she was so happy. A guy was in tears once because he was convinced he had eaten someone in his sleep. The worst for me though, we had a patient who was decided to kill herself. Nothing we could do would change her mind. We had to always have someone watching her because you'd never know when she would start trying to kill herself. She assaulted a nurse with a fire extinguisher and then tried to hit herself on the head with it. She tried to pierce her wrists with a fork. She stopped eating, threw herself at the walls and at the windows, and she would start crying if you stopped her. We had to strap her down a few times and would either thrash like the devil itself or just cry and ask why we wouldn't leave her alone. When someone looks you in the eyes and you can see they're not in their right mind, and they beg you to let them kill themselves, it's freaking terrifying. You can see that their mind is just completely broken. I just created a Reddit account in order to respond to this. I spent 6 years on a medicine psychiatry unit. I loved my patients. Having said that, among the bizarre and shocking things I've seen include a lady who could flip her legs over her head and pee in her own mouth, A dude who put his own poop in his mouth and spit it at staff. A person who eviscerated themselves with their bare hands and lived. The guy that punched me square in the face because I offered him a blanket. You're right. How rude. I've been hit, kicked, punched, pinched, slapped, hair pulled, spit on, bodily fluid smeared on. Had a patient suddenly grab the needle I was using to draw her blood and try to jam it in my hand. etc. The guy who drank bleach. Well, which guy who drank bleach? There were several. That's the tip of the iceberg, honestly. Those are literally top of my head instances, and they are just a handful of experiences. One thing I want to say, though, is that people with mental illnesses are among the most chronically underserved populations in healthcare, and that everyone deserves and is worthy of respect and empathy, even the poop spittin' folk. I remember a year or so ago, one of our revolving door patients was readmitted shortly after being discharged from her last admission. She didn't accept she had a mental disorder and so upon discharge immediately stopped taking her meds, became delusional and psychotic. As I walked onto the ward that morning, she collared me, clearly very cross about the circumstances leading to her admission. She had completely disengaged from mental health services and barricaded herself in the house, meaning police had to smash her door down with a battering ram. She seemed remarkably with it when she told me she wanted to lodge an official complaint. She said she wanted a list of all the people present when she was assessed for admission at her house. She knew who most of the professionals were, but she was unable to identify another man present and wanted me to find out who he was. His main identifying feature being that at the time he was dressed as a vampire. She said the vampire had lots of umbrellas and kept twirling them around before reflecting their crackers there. At this point I pretty much had to run off the ward to avoid hysterically laughing in her face. I mentioned it after to one of the psychiatrists who assessed her and she said, "Oh yeah, the vampire. Did we ever find out who that was?" My mum used to work in a mental health ward back in the 80s. One night she was trying to calm a patient down and the patient punched her in the face, broke her nose and stole her keys. By the time my mum got up, the patient was away. My mum was running towards a set of old double doors with D handles and the woman was on the other side. She saw my mum coming and slammed the door inhumanly hard into my mum. She burst her appendix, broke the majority of her ribs and punctured her liver. She then beat her within an inch of her life. The doctor treating her said that he had only seen wounds that bad from car crashes. My mum was then told she'd never have kids. She went on to have me and my brother, and she dropped to 6-7 pounds. My dad always said my mum was never the same after that. She always refused to take me to our local shopping center and insisted we went to the one further away. I never knew why until I was older and my mum told me the woman who did that to her was released from the hospital and she'd seen her in the shops one day and the woman said to her, "Remember me? I'm not finished with you," and then she just ran away laughing. Needless to say, my mum was terrified. She passed away last year with complications with her liver. Her doctor said the damage the woman caused was so severe that my mum's liver was basically only half functioning. It takes a very strong person to work in that environment and an even stronger person to go back to work after that. My mum worked up until 2002 when she was pregnant with my brother. I'm sorry to hear about your mom. My mom told me this story from her time at a neuropsychiatric ward while she was in grad school. She was making her routine room checks and happened upon the most horrific scene I've ever heard of as far as happening to someone I actually know. IRL. This was during the night shift, and generally all the patient's bedroom doors should be closed. So she turns a corner and is heading down another hallway of rooms and notices down the hall a door is open, and sees a staff member lying face down with their legs out of the door, and their upper half into the room. When she looks into the room, she sees the patient, a woman with a severe postpartum psychiatric disorder, who had just gouged both of her own eyes out of the socket with her bare hands, and was sitting cross-legged on the floor holding her eyes. The first staff member to witness the scene, who was now lying face down on the floor, had a heart attack when he first witnessed the woman while he was making his rounds. So here's my mom, screaming for any form of assistance, while frantically trying to perform CPR on the initial staff member, as a woman is sitting rather calmly, holding her own eyes. Holy frick, this is probably the most disturbing one yet. Had a patient use a pencil to poke a 6-inch deep wound into her breast tissue. Every chance she got she would dig around in the wound. She was addicted to surgical anesthesia and got it when her wound required surgery. We had her on one observation, but even so, she would find ways to make the wound worse. Really sad actually. She had kids and a loving husband, but she was just so addicted to self-harm and the anesthesia. She was eventually transferred to a more acute facility. There was another patient who trashed our unit. A big guy but not bigger than me. I'm 6 feet 5 inches 250 pounds. So, we thought we'd be able to handle him if he lost control. One day he decided he'd had enough of being at our facility, so he lifted a solid wood armchair over his head and threw it through the reinforced window. He then broke all of the wooden furniture, pretty much riding on anger and adrenaline. An odd memory I have of working there was when a 400-pound female patient tried to literally run me over. I simply got out of the way and of course she accused me of pushing her down. That was more pathetic than odd, I guess. I also had a guy fake hearing persecutory voices in his head so he could get more meds. We only knew he was faking when after several months we confirmed that he did not have schizophrenia. He was a male borderline personality disorder patient, which can be the most difficult type of person to work with. He would swallow anything he could find. CD cases, CDs, batteries, pens. He would get shipped off to the ER when he did so, then come right back to us. Such a waste of life. He was smart and funny but had a very self-destructive streak. Almost forgot to mention the crazy guy who held a pencil to my co-worker's throat like he was going to stab her. Myself and another employee, even larger than me, 6 feet 4 and 350 pounds, took him to the ground very quickly. I've never used an arm bar so quickly in my life, and I'm glad we did because he probably would have gone through with hurting the woman. Not my patient, but 16-year-old kid from a religious family in the UK comes into the psych ward after being passed around various doctors for quite some time. He believes he hears both the voice of God and Satan. The devil tells the kid to masturbate, whilst God tells him if he masturbates he will punish him and his family. Eventually he gives in to masturbating. He's 16. Go figure. And describes something fairly odd. He believes that every time he masturbates, his semen shoots back into his own body and travels up into his spine, and this allows the devil to control him and make him harm his family. He never actually hurt anyone during this, but he would freak out and try and hurt himself to stop the devil from letting him hurt other people. I have no idea what happened because, like I said, not my patient. Chances are he's still out there, still with schizophrenia. No one ever gets rid of these kinds of mental health problems. To be honest, he sounds like a good kid. Yay, completely batshit crazy but still a good guy. My dad is an artist and once did a series of art workshops in psychiatric hospitals for rehabilitation and art therapy and stuff. One day he's in this picturesque little psych hospital on the coast of Wales and one of the patients is gleefully telling everyone they saw an angel fly past their window. All of the staff are like, of course you did. Name. Of course you did. Laugh it off as innocent and adorable. Next time someone goes outside, someone is dead below the upper floor window. They got out somehow and jumped. It wasn't a high security hospital, but nothing like that had ever happened. They fell right past this guy's window, and he saw them as an angel. My dad was shaken up. We had a young lady in our custody with quite a few issues. We'll call her Jane. Jane's first night at our facility, staff doing a bed check found Jane in a puddle of blood. Turns out Jane had been slicing the skin around her shin with her fingernails and was pulling her skin up her leg, essentially degloving her calf. And NBSP. Jane also had a ritual she performed every night before bed. While in her room she would run between walls in her room, touching them in a crucifix pattern. After doing this for a few hours she would sit on her bed and go to sleep. This particular night Jean was frantic in her pace, practically running between walls. Our night staff observed the entire interaction and reported Jean screaming late into the night. When the staff went to check on Jean, she reported Jean standing in the doorway smiling. The staff asked what was wrong and Jane replied, "What makes you think you are speaking to Jane?" Well, I would just quit right there. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.